From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, and welcome to the second of the 8 lectures in our series this year. I am Nanette Gibbs from the Library's Science, Technology, and Business Division. Today we'll hear about NASA's mission to send groups of astronauts, engineers, and scientists to live and work in Aquarius, an undersea research station off the coast of Key Largo. Crew members encounter conditions and challenges similar to what they might experience on asteroids, our moon, or on Mars. They are able to simulate living on a spacecraft and can test and develop tools and techniques for future space missions. Dr. Young, who is a research scientist and planetary geologist, is a graduate of McLean High School and earned a BS in Environmental Geosciences from Notre Dame and an MS and PhD in Geological Sciences from Arizona State University. She spoke here last October on developing tools and training astronauts for planetary surface exploration. Please help me welcome Kelsey Young back to the library.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks Annette, and thanks to the library for having me back a second time. So I'm going to be talking about NEEMO today, which is NASA's underwater analog project. But first, I was going to introduce myself, but Nanette pretty much covered that. So I am a field geologist, and I do field geology here on Earth to prepare for when human beings go back beyond low Earth orbit. So I spend a lot of time out in analog environments. I just got back about 36 hours ago from California, where I was doing field work with this instrument here. So we're testing instruments and operational concepts for human beings when they go and conduct science on other planetary surfaces. So I'll talk to you a little bit about solar system exploration and the role that the NEEMO project in particular will play in it. So here's our solar system. Human beings have never ventured beyond our planet and its moon, but we have sent orbiters, rovers, and landers out to the far reaches of the solar system. Most recently, the New Horizons mission went out even past the end of our solar system, and just last week, Cassini actually went through Saturn's rings. So there's a lot going on in solar system exploration, but what I want to focus on today is human exploration in particular. So we've only ever sent human beings beyond our planet on 6 different missions from 1969 to 1972. 12 people walked on the surface of the moon, collecting samples, deploying surface science experiments, and on the later 3 missions actually using the lunar roving vehicle pictured here to travel even farther away from where they landed. The scientific experiments they were doing were pretty basic. They were using basic tools like rakes, shovels, scoops to collect and store samples for return to Earth, and those samples are still being studied today at the Johnson Space Center. And then they also deployed science experiments like basic seismic packages to look at the seismic structure of the upper lunar crust. And the lunar roving vehicle was used to transport all of these samples and experiments, as well as store samples to bring back to the lander. To do this, to practice for what they were going to be doing during Apollo, the 12 Apollo astronauts who actually ended up walking on the moon spent a great deal of time learning geology and field testing technology that they were going to use in Apollo. Geologists like to say that the Apollo astronauts essentially had earned the equivalent of a master's degree in geology by the time they flew to the moon. So they really knew what they were doing. They were highly trained by a group of skilled field geologists. And so they learned about geology in analog sites here on Earth. And then they also field tested the technology that they were going to use once they got to the surface of the moon. So this is the Apollo 17 crew actually using the cameras and technology that they'd eventually use during Apollo 17, as well as doing things like testing the suits and the lunar roving vehicle in relevant environments to the landing site that they were going to be visiting. So this idea of field testing technology in preparation for exploration has been around a long time, and it was incredibly successful in the Apollo generation. In fact, the Apollo astronauts who received the most training toward the later Apollo missions were actually incredibly successful in collecting samples that are a really robust part of the lunar science community today. Today, we continue that tradition of testing technologies and operational procedures in relevant environments. Here are just some of the environments that we're working on today. We have aquatic, terrestrial, and laboratory environments. For aquatic, I'll talk to you today a lot about the NEEMO experiment, but we also have the Neutral Buoyancy Lab at the Johnson Space Center, where there's full-size mock-ups of the International Space Station for the astronauts to actually practice EVAs or spacewalks on. ESA, the European Space Agency, also has their own neutral buoyancy facility. Terrestrially, we do a lot. Here is another analog project similar to NEEMO called Desert Rats, where rovers actually drive around in analog environments to prepare for when we're back on either the moon or Mars. We actually train astronauts in relevant field areas, just like we did in Apollo. So we take out all of the astronauts today into places like New Mexico and Arizona to train them for what they're going to be viewing from orbit and what they're hopefully going to be seeing when they go past low Earth orbit. And we also go to extreme environments from Antarctica up to the Arctic to test procedures and learn about processes that shape other planetary surfaces. In the laboratory, we have things like the Argos environment, the active response gravity offload system, which actually simulates what it's like to work in lower gravity than here on Earth. We use virtual reality and hybrid reality to actually immerse ourselves in environments like we see on other planets, so we can actually put ourselves on Mars and offload our gravity to experience what it would be like on Mars to simulate what astronauts are really going to be feeling once they get there. And then we have the International Space Station. So human beings are living every day up in space, a couple hundred miles above our heads, and that's a really robust laboratory to learn what it's like to work in microgravity. So we're learning about the health effects of long-term spaceflight, which is going to be really important on the journey to Mars. And the ISS is the most robust laboratory environment we have to really prepare for long-term spaceflight. But what we really want to spend a lot of time doing, and what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of today, are conducting highly integrated operational tests. So what I mean by that is operational tests sort of combine science, operations, and equipment or technology together in a mission-like environment to really simulate what it's going to be like to be on the moon or Mars. So the types of things that we're evaluating in these operational tests include concept of operations. So what is it actually going to look like when human beings are operating on the surface? During Apollo, we had 2 human beings operating together at one time. For 3 of the 6 missions, they had the lunar roving vehicle. When we go back beyond Earth, things are not going to look the same. Technology's come a long way, operational concepts have come a long way, and we need to practice to understand what these operational concepts are going to look like when we hopefully head back to the moon. We also want to test relevant hardware and tools for both pioneering and science tasks. And what I mean by that is, I'm a geologist. I'm looking forward to when astronauts bring back samples from other planets. So that's sort of a science task similar to what the Apollo guys were doing. So they were actually picking up rocks based on their geology training and returning them to Earth. We're also going to have pioneering tasks. So what I mean by that is basically if we have long-term space flight and human beings are living on another planetary surface for longer than the couple days they were there on Apollo, they'll have pioneering tasks to get ready for that long-term habitation. So they'll set up habitats, they'll set up communication structures, they'll deploy sort of weather monitoring stations on the surface of Mars. So we need to simulate what those pioneering tasks look like now, because we've never done that on another planetary surface. So we need to test the relevant hardware and technology that they're going to be using when they're doing that. And we also want to look at the tools and techniques that enable the communication between Earth, which will have a mission control center, MCC, and a science team, just like they had on Apollo, and the crew. And something I'm going to talk a lot about today is sort of the difference between IV and EV crew. So EVA is an extravehicular activity spacewalk. It's what the Apollo astronauts did when they spent 8 hours at a time roving over the lunar surface. We're hoping we'll get more than 2 crew members to another surface in the future, and if that's the case, we'll likely have an IV crew member or an intravehicular activity crew member who's sitting inside a habitat and helping to get eyes on an EVA and sort of quarterback the EVA. So I'll talk about that later in the context of NEEMO. But we want to sort of stress these tools and techniques that are going to enable this communication between Earth and the supporting teams and the crew who are actually doing the science. And we want to do this over an appropriate communication delay. So Mars is far enough away that when you send up a communication to Mars, it's going to take a long time for it to get there. It doesn't get there right away. So actually a communication loop between if I am sitting here on Earth sending a communication to somebody on Mars, it's going to take as much as 30 minutes to get there and back. So if you say, oh, wow, I see this amazing rock in your video screen, that was 15 minutes ago, right? So you need to understand how to flex this scientific operations over this long communication delay. And what we want to do is do that using a flexible execution methodology. And what we mean by that, and I'll talk about that a lot in this talk, is basically you go in with a traverse plan. The Apollo astronauts had their 8 hours pretty much scripted, and they knew exactly where they were going to go, when they were going to go there. What we want to do is give astronauts the technology and the training to be able to actually flexibly execute those traverses. So if they're driving down the dotted line on their traverse map, but they see something to the left off the traverse map, we want them to be able to be empowered to go and investigate it. The extreme example we use if an astronaut's on Mars and they're on this traverse path and they see a dinosaur bone off to the left that's not on the traverse path, we want them to turn left and pick up the bone, right? So that's sort of flexible execution. So we call it flexicuting a traverse plan. So I'll talk a lot about that today with NEEMO. So basically all of this together, we want to combine science, operations, and technology in a mission-like environment. So to do this, we go out in the field. We go out in relevant analog environments. So these analog missions allow for really early end-to-end testing of operational concepts and hardware. So these are just a couple examples of the analog missions NASA's run. Here's NEEMO, which I'll talk a lot about. Here are those Desert Rats missions where we simulated being on the surface of the moon. And the types of things we're doing are we're evaluating objectives that map to specific knowledge or technology gaps. So we're not ready to go to Mars. NASA's not ready to send humans to Mars. We have knowledge and technology gaps before we can get there. Analog missions are hoping to close some of these knowledge and technology gaps. We want to put the crew in a flight-like environment and also the ground team in a flight-like environment. So it's not just the crew that's going to be involved in exploration, it's all of us here on Earth, and we need to be trained for that. These types of operational tests, they drive out results that aren't found when you're just testing one tool or one technique at a time. You need to really put this in a robust, stressing environment that's going to stress the entire system and stress the participants involved. And this has benefits right now on ISS. I'll talk to you about this, but last year we were deploying experiments on ISS that a couple months later deploying experiments in NEEMO that a couple months later were deployed on ISS. So the types of testing we're doing in these analog missions have, current relevance to ISS as well as to NASA's future exploration goals. So bit of an eye chart, but this is just to show you the types of things that we're doing to prepare for hopefully sending humans to Mars and the types of experience that teams working here on Earth have. So Apollo is a big part of our experience. We learned a lot from the Apollo missions. There are still people that I work with today that were around in the Apollo age, but that's not gonna continue forever. These people are retiring. So we need to learn all we can now from the people who really did this, the only time we've ever sent human beings to another surface. We have Mars robotic missions. So we have 2 functioning rovers on the surface of Mars right now. They're obviously not human beings, but they require constant supervision and sending up new traverse plans every day. There are Mars rover planners working every day to develop the new ops plans for the 2 rovers that are up there now. And that's under this communication delay. So right now we're learning how to do science under a communication delay, and it's incredibly valuable experience. We have NEEMO, which I'll talk about, that's been run since the early 2000s. We have the Desert Rats rover missions, which similar to NEEMO, but above water. We have a number of science field campaigns in other relevant environments that are considerably smaller in scale than NEEMO. I just got back from one of them a couple days ago. So all of these things together are really, we're hoping, gonna together prepare us for hopefully putting boots on the ground on Mars. But NEEMO. The rest of the day I'm going to talk about the NEEMO analog project in particular. NEEMO stands for the NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations Test. It's been run in the Aquarius habitat since the early 2000s. And it's run through the Aquarius Reef-Based Facility that's run by Florida International University. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the Aquarius Reef-Based Facility and then sort of jump into the recent NEEMO missions and sort of what we're learning today and what we'll deploy in NEEMO 22 in a couple of months. So this is the shore facility that we use for the NEEMO tests. It's located in Isla Morada, Florida, in the Florida Keys. So sort of all the operation centers are in this building. There's a watch desk, which I'll show you a picture of in a second, where whenever a crew is in saturation in the habitat, there's somebody sitting at the watch desk 24/7 to monitor the health of the habitat and the health of the crew. There's a mission control center where the NASA team sets up to sort of pretend like we're in the mission control center in Houston. And there's a number of dive lockers for the support staff that support the crew in saturation. So here's sort of a map of the Florida Keys. Like I said, the Mission Control Center in the building on the previous slide is run by FIU, Florida International University, and it's about an hour and a half south of Miami. Here's the watch desk that's again manned 24/7, and it's situated right here on one of these canals, the ARB facility. If you just go 6 miles offshore, you get to the Aquarius habitat, which is pictured here. So this is sort of a model of Aquarius reef base itself. The bottom of the habitat sits at 62 feet of water, but the bottom of the habitable volume, which is here, sits at a little shallower at 50 feet. So these are the dimensions of the habitable volume, 9 feet in diameter and 43 feet long. And here's sort of a sketch of the volume that the crew spends all of their time in. So they basically come in through the wet porch. They just swim down and up into the habitat. And this is sort of the size of the space that they're living in, sort of like a big RV. So they have sort of areas to do science experiments. They have a dining room table to eat dinner at. And then they have bunks back here, as well as several viewports where they can actually, look outside at what's around them, including one at the back right by their beds. So here's a view from the bunk room looking sort of down, from the bunks down this way. So here's the outside of the hab, and this is the viewport that they can see from their beds. And here are the bunks themselves. There are 6 bunks, 3 on each side. And here's just some pictures to give you an idea of what it looks like inside Aquarius. We've got sort of, it's a very small working space, and they can, sort of eat and do science on either side of it. This is the wet porch that they can swim up and in. And in general, it's a lot like, living on the International Space Station. It's a cramped environment. You're in there with a lot of people. So hopefully you get along with the other 5 people in the habitat. Here are the onshore facilities that we have, the ARB facility has. There's a fleet of boats to take divers to and from the dive site. There's the NASA office and the Mission Control Center, like I mentioned, internet, conference, meeting area, labs, computers, a workshop area in case, they actually need to machine anything, dive lockers, a rest area, and they actually have a hyperbaric chamber and safety equipment in case of an incident or accident happening during a mission, which has never happened, not to worry. And then there's also a life support buoy out at the site itself. So Aquarius sits underwater underneath the life support buoy. It's got generators, compressors, communications to beam back the comms from the crew directly to the facility on shore. And again, it sits directly above the habitat. And here's a human up here for scale. So Aquarius sits in the Carpenter Basin. So Aquarius is actually labeled AQ right here. That's where the habitat is. And this is just to give you an idea of the scale of the sort of the exploration area of the crew during a mission. These are all sort of landmarks that the team has worked out over a number of years. Some of these are sampling sites from previous NEEMO missions, which I'll talk about. This data, or this map, is overlain on bathymetry data, so you can actually see the sort of dimensions of the bottom of the seafloor here. You can see sort of lots of striations in the floor, and that's actually, coral features that are on the bottom of the seafloor, which is actually what the astronauts are exploring when they're out on simulated EVA. So all of this together really enables NASA to operate in a high fidelity environment. So we can test operational concepts and procedures in a space-like environment. We can play with usability and design trade-offs. So it enables us to be in an environment where we can really test different types of technology year after year after year and experiment with the trade-offs that are involved with one technology over another. It enables us to build up a workforce that's knowledgeable and experienced in this type of exploration, which is really, really important as we, hopefully build past the Earth. It builds these workforce knowledge gaps, like I said earlier, on how to execute really complex operational procedures. And it has early and relevant end operator input. So the astronauts are the ones that are going to be out on these other planets doing exploration, and it enables these people, these astronauts, to get in this habitat and get their hands on developing technology. So it gets them experience, but it also enables them to give us experience. So if there's a technology that they really just don't like or don't think is going to work in spaceflight, this is a way for us to work that out early rather than when we're on our way to Mars. And lastly, and I think it's really important, it's a proven PAO tool, a public outreach tool for keeping the public inspired and engaged in space exploration. We may not have humans beyond Earth and ISS right now, but we are working toward, sending humans, putting boots on the ground on Mars, and it's really important that the public be engaged in that effort. So, diving into NEEMO 21. Diving puns. So NEEMO 21 was this past year in 2016. The mission was actually 16 days long, living and working in the Aquarius Reef Base facility. We had completed a variety of objectives, which I'll talk to you on the next slide. We had an international crew, which actually part of the crew rotated out mid-mission. So here are the crew here. We had Americans, one from South Africa, one from Germany, and one from Ireland. So we had an engineering week where we actually tested a lot of the technology that we were going to be using during the mission. So that was well in advance of the mission to sort of iterate on any design requirements that needed to be changed. We had a crew training week at the Johnson Space Center where all the crew members flew to Houston and enabled all of the mission operators to train them on the types of technology they were going to be using. We had a test readiness review, which is actually where we sit with the safety officers at the Johnson Space Center to make sure everyone's comfortable with putting these test subjects in this environment. We had a training week actually down in Florida just the week before the mission to, get hands-on training and teach the divers, teach the crew members how to do saturation diving. And then we had the mission, which was 16 days long. So I want to talk to you about the science and operations and technology advancements from the mission. Do not worry about reading the slide. This is just to show all the partners that we had for the mission. So a really unique and exciting thing about NEEMO is that, it's run by NASA at NASA, but we have a lot of external partners that enables a big part of the community to get involved. And that's contributed a lot to the success of this program. So this is just a graphic to show you all the partners that we had involved in this mission. And I'll talk about the contributions from several of them over the course of this talk. But suffice it to say, we had a lot of NASA centers involved. We had PIs from different research institutions involved. We had several academic institutions, private research institutions. We had the military involved, and we had a number of different contributors from industry across the country. So our science objectives, I'll give a high-level overview and then I'll dive into a little bit of detail there. One of our objectives was nursery construction and science, and I'll talk about that in the next couple slides, but we partnered with the Coral Restoration Foundation, which is a nonprofit based in the Keys that's actually working on exploring why corals are dying off. You might have heard in the news there are corals all over the world, including the Great Barrier Reef, that are really struggling. So the Coral Restoration Foundation is trying to understand why this is happening and perhaps more importantly, figure out how to repopulate some of these reefs. So NEEMO has a big part in that research, and I'll talk about that in a bit. We have follow-up science, and that's because, NASA's been working in this area for a number of years. Specifically in NEEMO 20 was the first year that we had really integrated science objectives, coral science objectives with the NEEMO program. So the crew in NEEMO 20 back in 2015 collected a bunch of samples, and we went back in NEEMO 21 to investigate how those sites have changed over time. We also had new exploration. So this is sort of an exploration zone map of the Carpenter Basin around Aquarius. We had 5 exploration zones that the crew could go in. And those are sort of just, those exploration zones were defined so that, both the ground control team and the crew could sort of reference something on a map and have something to track back to for mission planning. So now, from NEEMO 20 to NEEMO 21 last year through NEEMO 22 this year, we have really authentic, robust coral science that's fully integrated into NEEMO EVA operations. So that's really exciting. It's something the NEEMO team is really proud of. And we're doing this under a lot of hours of EVA. So we had over 60 hours of science-based EVA last year, and we were able to get a lot of really exciting coral science done. So here's the Coral Restoration Foundation. Again, they're a nonprofit organization, and they're dedicated to creating and maintaining these offshore nurseries for threatened coral species. So they want to build these coral nurseries and restoration techniques and understand what the best way is to restore these reefs and empower others and train others to do the same thing around the world. So here are some of the types of nurseries that CRF is working with, and they're spread over a number of different locations. And I'll talk to you specifically about the nursery work that's going on in the NEEMO area. So for NEEMO, we work extensively with CRF. CRF is able to prepare the astronauts, process the corals, train the astronauts, and train the ground control team to support the mission. So the corals are actually put on these little sort of like credit card or playing card sized little pieces of plastic, and they're sort of cultivated in the CRF facility in the Keys. This is actually Ken Niedermeyer who runs CRF, and he's a big partner of NEEMO, and we've really enjoyed working with CRF. And so here they are sort of training the crew in the onshore facility on how to actually physically construct the trees, because in NEEMO 21, the crews actually took these cards that the coral scientists prepared and mounted them on the coral trees themselves underwater, where they've been since last August. So once the cards were constructed and the crew was trained, we had to physically transport them to the site. So took them out on a boat and put them here in these sort of milk crates here. And the crew actually took them to the 2 sites designated in the Carpenter Basin and deployed 5 of these trees at each site. And each tree has 100 coral cards on it. So we really do have a lot of coral colony or coral species growing underwater now, and they've been under there for almost a year. So this year we're going to be able to go back and see how they're doing. So these are just some of the process of the crew last year actually setting up the nurseries. And one of the cool fun facts from last year that we actually on purpose did not tell the crew until the day of this relevant EVA, but they built the deepest coral nursery in the world last year. So it's really exciting, and they're comparing the coral scientists are comparing the shallow nurseries and the deep nurseries to compare which species grow the best at which depths and in which water conditions. So then we actually wanted to conduct science and operations on the nursery. So here's Ken and our science team, Mission Control. This is the science team here and our little trailer outside in the parking lot of the onshore facility. And so they're actually, they mounted all the coral cards and then took pictures of all of them so the coral scientists back in the trailer could evaluate which corals even survived the trip, because corals are fragile. That's one of the reasons we're in this situation. We want to make sure that journey out to Aquarius and underwater, they made it through, so that a year from now we'll know that any of the corals who died off actually occurred in the year since they were planted, not the initial effort of getting them out there. So for marine exploration science, we've partnered with the Images Lab at FIU. So it's the Integrative Marine Genomics and Symbiosis Lab at FIU, just a really robust coral science facility. And they have a lot of science objectives. We've partnered with them since NEEMO 20, and they're doing real science on these coral colonies with the samples that the NEEMO crews are collecting. So in NEEMO 20, they were sampling the Siderastria type of coral. I've learned a lot about coral in the last couple years. And then in NEEMO 21, they were looking at the Agaricea species and the Orbicella species, as well as, again, actually doing some science on the coral colonies themselves. So they want to genetically characterize the types of corals from the depths that they're collected from. They want time and depth constraints. So precisely when they were collected and from what depth is really important when you're thinking about coral science. So we have to train the crew to really pay attention to their depth gauges and making sure that the corals they're collecting are at relevant depths for the science team. And we want to provide a natural baseline for those coral restoration efforts. So they're exploring the local corals to figure out how they might relate to the corals that are on the nurseries. And so this ultimately they want to influence and inform the coral restoration efforts, as well as understanding this, really this reef environment that's really in flux. So that's sort of the science we're doing, but moving on to the science operations, so what it's actually like to conduct science in this relevant environment. Again, I'll go into into detail about some of these, but we looked at integrated EVA science operations, so what the communication structure between a crew on EVA, their supporting crew member who's sitting inside the habitat, the mission control center, and the science team back on Earth. So that's, 4 variables who, all want to get their opinions heard. So flexing this communication structure became, really important to test. And last year in NEEMO 21, we did this under a 15-minute one-way communication delay. So again, if I'm sitting in the science trailer and I send a communication to the crew, it gets there 15 minutes later, they read it, they have to send a response, and 15 minutes later, I see that response. So we're flexing this communication structure under this high communication latency. So then we had navigation, map, and traverse planning science operations objectives that we were testing. We used different navigation technologies as well as crew training and sort of IT assets to have actually on EVA. I'll talk about that in a bit. Just to briefly mention, we had an optical communications experiment deployed by a student group from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University with us last year. And we had a remotely operated vehicle, an ROV, from the Naval Postgraduate School that was also tested last year. But to dive into this sort of communication structure a little bit more, this is sort of just an image to show, here's us in the science trailer last year who were actually communicating directly with the intravehicular, the IV crew member here, which I'll talk about in a bit, who then could communicate with the EV crew member. And things to think about is that there's a communication delay between science team and IV, but there's no communication delay between the habitat and the people who are boots on the ground. So experimenting with this communication delay, where it occurs and where it matters, became really important. And developing the technology to support that delay, to support communication over the delay, is something that's iteratively tested from year to year with NEEMO. So our objectives with looking at this integrated science operation structure last year were just to figure out how this works, operate it under a communication delay, and there are definitely kinks, but those kinks are results, right? So we want to determine what functions and capabilities are needed by every part of that communications loop to enable them to do their job. For example, this IV person, one of the things we found was they are very busy. They are extremely busy. They have mission control and science team saying, ooh, go collect that coral. That was great. And mission control saying, okay, EVA, 1 hour left. You got to hurry up. And then you have the EV crew streaming back all this data to them that they're trying to keep control of and manage. So giving them the technology that they need to manage all of those different variables is one of the main takeaways from NEEMO. And then one of the other things that I mentioned earlier is this flexecution idea. Flexecution, it sounds sort of straightforward, flexible execution, not something that NASA's really done before. We operate under scripted timelines, and being able to go to NASA and say, scientists really need astronauts to be able to be flexible is like this whole new language. But it's a language we're starting to learn and we're starting to understand. So this is, something I spend a lot of my time thinking about, and I think it sounds straightforward, but it's definitely a big hurdle. But it's an exciting one, I think. So the takeaways from this sort of study last year was that we successfully exercised these full comm loops with passing a bunch of data back and forth, communications from the crew to the science team and back to the EV via the IV. We sort of stressed this whole loop over the 16-day mission and really felt like we had a number of situations that presented themselves where we got to stress that system and put it under pressure a little bit, which is important in tests like this. And so we also observed the criticality of these flexecution flight rules. So being able to be flexible is important, and training a crew so that they feel confident enough in the science to be flexible is important, and it's something we did last year in NEEMO. But we also want to have flight rules, right? Like unbreakable rules that no matter what, no matter if there's a dinosaur bone over there are rules that you cannot break, right? So developing those flight rules is really important, and it's something that we'll certainly have, nailed down when we send human beings beyond Earth. So another objective we had was, again, assessing the tools and technology needs, and this includes both hardware and software. So the tools that the astronaut are actually holding, what that hardware looks like, as well as what's displayed on screens and things like that. So we're assessing the tools needs for both short distance navigation from site to site to site to support this type of geology, or in this case, coral science. So the takeaways are that the crew successfully used digital maps, digital traverse plans, and an active system to locate pertinent sampling zones. So they had this navigation equipment they were using, and they also had basically an underwater iPad that they were able to actually view traverse plans with and sampling procedures with. So here's a traverse for one of the days last year that they were actually able to navigate with underwater. So they were actually able to successfully do that. But one of the key lessons learned for us on the shore side of things, the science team side of things, is under this sort of time latent planning cycle, so with a high communications delays, we need to make sure that we update the plan, we keep them apprised as our plans evolve from one day to the next in a timely manner, so that they can sit down before they go EVA and say, okay, here's the plan. We know this plan is not going to change. Here's the flight rules. Here's the traverse plan. If we see this, we deviate from the traverse plan, but only if it's within the. So they have to have that information with enough time to feel confident that the crew can really effectively and efficiently operate the plan. So technology too, sort of similar to the last slide I just talked about, but. What we were looking at is digital cue cards. So here's that underwater iPad we were testing, and they were actually able to pull up all sorts of things on these underwater iPads, and I'll talk about that in a second. The IV support system, like I mentioned, it was really important to give the IV person the assets they needed to be successful in a really busy position. We also had science sampling tools and a geology sampling kit that the EVA tools group at the Johnson Space Center is developing. So they tested that extensively at NEEMO as well last year. So here's sort of the digital cue card. They had mission maps, they had the images and traverse plans, they had the marine science procedures, as well as sort of a guide to help them identify coral. They had procedures for how to build the coral nurseries. They had procedures for how to operate the that sampling kit I just mentioned, procedures for optical comm, a list of equipment and how to use it, and then a number of sort of operationally minded things to enable them to flip back and forth between all of those assets. So they had procedures that they could pull up. This is the geoscience sampling procedure that with one click of a button they can get there on the underwater iPad. And so that enables them to really pull up what they need at a drop of a hat. It also implies that they're highly trained in how to use the iPad, which is really important. But we were able to really operate these digital cue cards effectively, and the crew had a lot of really solid feedback that said it was really helpful for them to say, okay, if it's this type of coral, we want to sample with this specific technology, and here's the procedure for how to do that. Toward the end of the mission, they didn't need those procedures as much, but in the beginning, it really helped them sort of refresh their memory from the training they got from the coral scientists. And if there was a particularly complex piece of machinery, they could pull up the procedure. If anything ever malfunctioned, we had procedures for that in the cue cards, which they could pull them up. And that increases this autonomy and the feeling for the crew that they can really do this under a communication delay. If they have a problem, they don't have to wait 30 minutes for a troubleshooting procedure on how to fix it from the shore. And this is also a really efficient way for the science team back on Earth or on the shore to iteratively evolve those traverse plans from day to day. So part of the procedure was at the end of every EVA, the science team would go and refine the traverse plan for the next day, and we could upload that new traverse plan to the cue card so it was waiting for the astronauts the next day, and which is something that you can't do with pen and ink. So from a IV support station or IV support sort of workstation perspective, we wanted to evaluate what assets the IV crew member would need to be successful in helping the EV crew sort of operate their traverse plan. So this is Matthias. He's one of the European astronauts who was a crew member last year. And for that particular EVA, he was this IV person, and he had to monitor all of these things at one time. The EVAs are about 4 hours long, so he's sitting at that desk for 4 hours helping the EV crew to operate the plan and get the data from the science team as it evolves. So we want to learn what they need to be successful. How many monitors is too many monitors? Is there a monitor where you can put multiple things on one monitor so you can minimize the sort of desk space that the IV crew needs? And what we really have learned from NEEMO and from the rover tests before it is that this IV role is absolutely crucial. They're really, really critical, especially under a time delay, in helping the EV crew be successful. And the reason for that is that under a time delay, I've sent a message up to the crew and it doesn't get there for 15 minutes. What if they're involved in something really detailed with their, that they're doing on the surface when that communication comes through? They get kind of annoyed when someone's squawking in their ear. That was something that was relevant 15 minutes ago that they're getting when they're busy. But having this IV hub as someone who can receive that communication, and when there's a down minute, they can pass it on to the EV crew, is really important. Especially when we're doing reef exploration where the coral scientists are saying, oh, we want that coral, pick that one. We can use this IV person as a way to streamline that communication. And the way we do that is through assets like this that are displayed on these computers. So this is actually the mission log that the IV crew member sees. So this is a communication I wrote last year to Matthias. And what it says is basically, we saw this view in one of the EV crew's cameras, half an hour ago. We screenshotted it, drew a box around it, and said, tell them to go back to where you put this number down and pick up that coral, sample that coral. And we can do that through the IV person. So when Matthias sees that come on his screen, he says, okay, go back to where you put down this tag number and then go up an inch and sample there, right? Which is just not possible if you're sending that communication directly to the EV crew member. So we need to explore these assets and figure out exactly what the best thing is for this person to have. And then we have the geology sampling system, just a couple of photos to show you the types of samples that they could pick up. It enables them to pick up loosely adhered particles on the floor, chip samples, as well as to take core samples. So last year we were really able to utilize this system. It worked really well for taking and storing samples, which is relevant for doing that and curating and storing samples for return to Earth in a Mars or Moon environment. We also, just briefly, I'll skim through these, we had IV activities. So we had a crew of 4 last year. Typically during the day, 2 people would be on an EVA, 1 person would be supporting them from the IV position, which left the 4th crew member to do things like all of these really exciting IV activities. So we had a number of studies, which I won't dwell on, but just to highlight a couple, This was the timeline tool that NASA Ames deployed for the mission, where the crew could keep track of their own timeline, and you could actually get into procedures from here. So they're testing this playbook timeline tool, and they're doing it again this year for NEEMO. Johns Hopkins ran sort of a sensory motor study. Really exciting, and I'll have a slide on it in a bit, is the mini DNA sequencer. So Matthias is there actually sequencing DNA underwater, and 2 months later, Kate Rubins sequenced DNA for the first time in space on ISS. So that was just really exciting to be a part of last year, and this is like really cutting edge science that is happening on ISS, today. We also used a HoloLens, so sort of augmented reality, to figure out for crew where they should store and get a piece of gear. So in a volume that small, everything is packed really carefully, which means it's packed really tightly. And sometimes you forget where you put something. But HoloLens can actually enable you to say, okay, 10 days ago, where did I pack this little thing? And you can actually put it on and find it with augmented reality in the habitat. We are also testing miniaturized exercise devices. So one thing we're finding with long duration spaceflight is it's really, really important for astronauts to stay fit and stay in shape. And so we had an exercise team from the Johnson Space Center with us. We had a number of European Space Agency evaluations, and we had things like the EVA swab tool, which looks at forward contamination by astronauts in a spacesuit to make sure we're not contaminating our working space. Here's just a highlight on the DNA sequencing. So all the crew members were able to get through it last year. Reed was very excited. It's exciting. So we had members of the Mini Ion DNA sequencing team down in Florida with us last year. Here's Kate after she successfully sequenced DNA in space for the first time. She was actually a molecular biologist by training, so this was really a cool thing for her to be able to actually get to do. So this was just a real highlight of last year, and to working out the procedures and how to use it operationally in a flight-like environment during NEEMO actually prepares, there's Matthias using it in NEEMO, prepared Kate to be able to do it in space. So that was NEEMO 21. Briefly, I'll skim through, what time is it? How much time? 12:15. Okay. So NEEMO 22 is coming up this summer. So I'll just briefly highlight some of the things we're going to be doing that builds on the success of NEEMO 21. One is we're going to take cores with a new breakaway core bit technology that was developed by Honeybee Robotics, which builds a lot of the drills for the Mars rovers. So they're drilling experts, and so we're playing with this new breakaway core bit technology and deploying it in, again, a mission flight-like environment. And it has relevancy to that geology sampling system, just with sort of a new core technology. And it's got a lot of curation implications for future sample storage on Mars. Briefly, again, I know this is sort of hard to see, but we're playing with tool transport on EVA. So there's a lot of tools to sample corals and also rocks on Mars. So managing all these tools in an environment where if you drop something, it'll float away is a non-trivial issue. So what we were finding last year is there were some frustrations with managing, for example, to sample corals, you can chip them away or drill them away, and then you have to put them in these small syringes. And you would imagine you're doing something with both your hands. Where are you going to put the syringe? You can't just put it down because it'll float away. So managing all these tiny little tools becomes a non-trivial problem. So we're playing with equipment transport and storage this year, and the EVA tools group at JSC has done just an outstanding job with thinking through this, what we're calling a modular equipment transport system that's stored in this cart that the crew has to pull around with them while they're on EVA and store all of these sampling technologies. One thing I'm really excited about is I look at instruments for astronauts to use on Mars, so something that they'd hold in their hand to actually analyze the rocks real time. We have analogs for those underwater. So we have sort of two instruments that we're deploying this year to look at the photosynthetic state and the metabolic state of corals. So we're actually deploying those instruments this year as well, and all this stuff will fit both on the cart and on the astronauts themselves through a wrist storage unit and a leg storage unit, so they can pull out a syringe from their wrist without having to carry it long distances from the cart. So this is sort of the operating strategy for every EVA, and again, this was all sort of thought up and then constructed by the EVA tools group that actually builds tools for human spaceflight. So the crew will egress from the Aquarius habitat, and they'll head to the staging area where their modular equipment transport system's waiting for them. They'll arrive at the staging area and pick the modules from the staging area that they know they're going to need for that EVA. So if today's a day where I need to deploy the instruments, I'm going to make sure I get the instrument modules and put them on the cart because I need them for that day. You traverse through all these coral towers and get to your zone where you're going to be exploring that day, which the science team has suggested as a plan for that day. And here potentially in zone A is 3 sites of interest where we think, the science team thinks, they might be able to find interesting coral colonies. And they'll take the cart with them to the zone and then take those small modules with them to each site so they don't have to drag this big honking heavy cart with them wherever they go. Then they'll collect their samples, return to the cart, and then return to the staging area at the end of the EVA. So here's just some of the types of the tools that the tools group has worked on in the modules that we're going to be using. We've got a drill for sampling coral. One of the things that I thought has been really interesting is this pre-sampling module. So if you have a crew member who gets to a zone that they've never been to before, they take these little tags, which are about this big, and they'll walk around the zone and actually put down a tag every time they think there might be a coral of interest, and then they can come back later and pick the most compelling samples from those couple that they've temporary tagged. So we have the small tool module for the little dexterous tools that you need to actually put the coral in the syringes. And then you have the actual syringes themselves and where they're stored. So these are some of the types of modules that I'm talking about that go in this cart. For the IV support system this year, we're evaluating a couple different tools that will be running in the background of some of these monitors that the IV person's responsible for monitoring. We're also want to minimize, I mean, this is ridiculous. Like, this is crazy for the IV person to have to pay attention to what the ground control team is telling them and what the EV crew is telling them. So we're trying to minimize the number of computers and monitors that are required for this IV person to handle. But what we're finding is that all of this software is vital to, both mission safety and the scientific success of a mission. So we're playing with the types of software that the IV person needs to be running. For a science perspective, we're retrieving the coral cards from both of the nurseries. We call them the Mercury and Atlas nurseries, where the crew is going to retrieve all the cards, transport the cards, and document any that may have died off, and potentially sample them if the science team deems it's necessary. They'll take them back, do the documentation and the potential sampling, and then they'll return the coral cards back to the nursery and reconfigure the cards in sort of this way. So what it's been done before is that each arm of the coral nursery has the cards hanging down off of them. The Coral Restoration Foundation found that they actually want to flip them up and mount them in a more stable configuration. And that's one of the results from actually being able to do this study. So it's exciting that we're seeing a year later sort of a new action that needs to be done for this type of coral nursery. For re-follow-up, we're going to follow up on NEEMO 20 and NEEMO 21 to create this robust 3-year temporal assessment of how the corals do over a 3-year period. There have actually been disease that's developed throughout the Keys, and one of the examples of that disease development is unfortunately around Aquarius. So, but it's exciting that we get a chance to potentially help figure out what's going on with this disease development around the Keys. And one of the areas that they're going to do that is this year at NEEMO around Aquarius. And then they're just going to explore new coral colonies that they've already sort of sampled from previous years and tagged in previous years, and resample and look at how they've developed over time. And then explore and expand into new sites. So we haven't covered this entire Carpenter Basin over the last couple years. So we're going to explore into newly explored sites and deploy the instruments to measure respiration and photosynthesis using these new instruments. And then we're also going to look at corals as they relate to the colonies that are deployed in the nurseries. I'll skim through these. These are just my last couple slides. They're hard to read, so I can read them. These are our science operations objectives, and they're split into 4 T's: tools, techniques, technology, and training. So for tools, we want to understand how this modular transport system relates to science-driven EVAs. Does it help? Does it hurt? How operationally does the crew use it? How is the core sampling tool going to be incorporated? Is it a timeline hit? Is it going to take longer than the alternate methods of sampling corals? We're going to look at deploying handheld instruments, like I said, into science-driven EVA, which is not something we've done before. Technologies, what's the role of informatics, so those digital cue cards, what's the role that they play in science-driven EVAs? What happens if you have a camera mounted for situational awareness? So if I'm working at this computer as an outcrop and there's a camera over here, how useful is that camera for situational awareness for the IV crew member and the mission support team on Earth? And again, the role of the IV workstation, because that's not something we've done before past analog missions like this. Flexecution, operational flexibility is really important, so we're going to continue to play with that. And what tools and technologies do you need to develop to support this flexible execution? And what does the communication flow look like? I mentioned that's a big deal, especially under communication delays. So playing with the structure of how data flows from one support team to another to the crew is something we'll need to continue to test. And then training. We're not only training the astronauts, but we're also training ourselves, the ground team. So anybody who's involved in this test gets a better understanding of a flight-like environment through a test like NEEMO. And that's really important to capture those lessons learned as they evolve, to make sure that when we do this for real, we're ready as a ground team and as a crew. And again, just to leave you with a couple thoughts, I think for outreach, this is really important. We had a lot of excitement over this image last year. Here's the 6 people who are living in the habitat. They're reading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And the reason they're wearing these masks is that's what needs to happen when you're in saturation. You want to come back up to the surface. You need to decompress in a specific way. So that's what they're doing here. This is the last day before they came up. We had a lot of social media following. We were excited that Ellen Ochoa, the center director of JSC, got really into it and tweeted something. And one of the things that I thought was especially cool about last year was the EVA Tools Group at Johnson Space Center works with college students from around the country to develop new ideas for sampling in different gravity environments. So every year they run this program. It's called MicroG Next, and they have university students, propose these ideas and build these tools for sampling in lower gravity. And one of the tools that one of the groups came up with last year was to build this different type of coring tube. And the EVA Tools group liked it so much that they asked and actually used it in NEEMO last year. So that was a pretty exciting example of really fast end-to-end testing from a university group. And just sort of to leave you with the sort of above and below life, it really is a robust analog project. You can see the LSB, the life support buoy here. This was a day where we had 2 female crew members on EVA, so we staffed mission control with all of the women there, which I thought was really neat. A team picture from NEEMO 21 last year. The 2 NASA astronauts who are our crew last year, Reed Weissman and Megan Bankin. And then this is Roger Garcia, who runs the entire facility, and so he really enables all this stuff to happen. So I'll leave this and I'll take questions. Thanks.
You said that the IB role was really critical, and this is an international group.
Yeah, this is an international group.
It's an international group. So
Yeah.
we were seeing Matthias.
Mhm.
He was French or German or
Yeah, German. Yeah.
German. So is he the only one, or do people rotate through the role?
Yeah, so the question is, we work with international partners, and is Matthias, the astronaut from last year, is he the only one, or do we have other international participation? We definitely do. So both of the 2 active Canadian astronauts, David St. Jacques and Jeremy Hansen, have been crew members already for NEEMO. We've had most, if not all, of the JAXA, the Japanese crew members, been crew members on NEEMO. And most of the ESA, the European Space Agency crew members, have gone through already. And then we also have, especially from ESA, we've had support team members come as well. So we have the Capcom role, which is the traditional role of the person who sits in mission control in Houston that communicates to ISS. That Capcom role is filled by a rotating cast of people for NEEMO, and we have international Capcoms that come as well. So we have a lot of international participation with our sort of partner space agencies, and it's been, I think, one of the more successful parts of the mission. It's been exciting to see. In the back.
Thank you. This is super awesome.
Oh, good.
You talk about the nurseries, the coral nurseries. What about any kind of prototyping of nurseries for growing food in this underground or aquatic
Yeah.
station? And then what are they eating and how are they preparing food?
Yeah, so lots of questions about food, which I love. So how do they grow food, and what do they eat? So they don't grow food in NEEMO. We've done that with the rats testing, the rover testing. We tested a habitat lab for rats, and we actually grew lettuce and ate it at the end. It was delicious. And they're doing that on ISS, of course. They're growing vegetables or lettuce up on the International Space Station. In fact, I think I saw this morning or yesterday morning they were eating Chinese cabbage. Yeah. So Yeah. What for here, so one of the tricky things operationally about NEEMO is getting things underwater is non-trivial. So getting, for example, if you have a bag of food that's not punctured and you bring that volume of air down 60 feet, it doesn't react very well. So any food that they get down there is very carefully prepared. For example, they have to puncture all of their like K-cups for coffee before they bring them down. Otherwise, so they eat. I mean, they don't eat anything out of the ordinary. So they'll eat. I think one crew in particular got really into Pringles, from what I hear. They'll do dehydrated food. They eat pretty normally down there. Yeah.
You mentioned you're a geologist.
Yes.
And you're talking a lot about the exciting things that lead to ISS
Mhm.
and hopefully boots on the ground. Could you tell us a little bit about where we are technology-wise, the radiation aspects on Mars? And you talked about EVAs that are 4 hours. If, regardless of how long they were there for a year or 2 years, could they last for 4 hours at this current status on what our technology is?
Yeah.
What do we need to do to overcome that so that it's a reality?
Yeah. So basically, what are the technological hurdles to doing this on Mars? There are a lot. Radiation, you mentioned, is a huge one. So radiation shielding and protecting from space weather is huge. We got lucky with Apollo. We didn't have any major radiation events while the astronauts were on the surface. We can't guarantee that that's going to happen again. So protecting from radiation, especially for the long durations it'll take to get to Mars, stay on Mars, and get back, is extremely non-trivial. So that's a major area of ongoing technology development right now. Launch and landing is a big deal as well. So landing that much mass on the surface of Mars is really challenging. The most we've landed is the MSL rover, the Curiosity rover that's up there right now, and we did that with this incredibly complex and really cool sky crane technology, where it sort of braked and then thrusters fired and it hovered above the ground and a crane actually lowered down the rover, which like blows my mind every time we think about we did that successfully. But the mass required for human habitation is orders of magnitude larger than that rover. So figuring out how to, get human beings to Mars and land them safely is another ongoing area of research. Of course, you may have heard in the news about the SLS rocket launch system, the heavy launch vehicle that NASA's developing. That's an ongoing area of research that NASA is heavily involved in right now. So from a big picture, we have the rockets, we have launch and landing, we have radiation, we have human health for long-term space flight. So what happens to a human body when they're in low gravity for that long? So those are sort of the big picture questions that NASA is doing a really good job of investigating right now. From a geology standpoint, which is the stuff that I spend my days thinking about, a lot of the stuff I mentioned, even though NEEMO's underwater and they're looking at corals, is incredibly relevant. Operationally, yes, we've done this before. Like humans collected a lot of really interesting science samples from Apollo, but technology has come a long way since then, and hopefully when human beings do this for real, they'll have more robust instruments that they're able to use, and figuring out how to incorporate those into EVA is important. Figuring out how to design the hardware and software for EVA is important, and that's, the types of people that I work with are working on that right now. So.
The DNA sequencing, are you using there's a new thing called rapid DNA that does it quickly, but how do you do it in such a small space? And then do you have your own data repository where you're keeping all the data and then you transmit it up? And then how long does it take?
So I do not claim to be a member of their team. I was thrilled to work with them, next to them, but I'm definitely not on the team for that. But to answer your question as best I can, which was about, operating the mini DNA sequencer, it's this, they basically get the sample, and the instrument itself is like this big, and they actually feed the sample in, and it runs, pretty quickly in a matter of an hour or two. At least the sequences they were running on NEEMO last year. And they download the data locally, and then they have to send it up in a big chunk. Yeah.
As a diver, I'm just curious about the decompression that they have to go through. You said 16 days was the longest
Yeah.
that they stay? Is
Well, I don't know if that's the longest ever. That was what NEEMO 21 was.
okay.
Yeah.
I was wondering if that was because of decompression or if they're saying more effects of that.
Nope, that was, so why the 16-day duration in terms of saturation diving? Definitely not the limit. It was just what we had available to us in terms of scheduling for NASA last year. I'm pretty sure there have been longer missions. It doesn't have to do with the saturation limits at all. We do have to be careful, and they have this down to an absolute science at this facility. We don't want to go too deep on the EVAs for too long. So planning the EVAs revolves, of course, around safety first. And so the crew at the Aquarius Reef Base Shore facility basically gives us our unbreakable flight rules, and they monitor every EVA to make sure the crews aren't staying too deep too long.
Are they all trained divers?
Yes. Oh, yes. Saturation divers, too. They go through special saturation dive training. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.